1 week. That's all. I was gone 7 days to bury my father 3 states away. I came home to a backhoe eating my house. Picture it. I turn on to Wexford Court in my funeral suit, and there's a machine parked where my front porch used to be. My magnolia is snapped off at the trunk. Red dust hangs in the July heat like smoke, and 50 years of my daddy's brick he set by hand in 1971 brick with his initials pressed into the corners is coming down one swing at a time. I didn't get out of the truck. I couldn't. I just sat there with my hands on the wheel and watched the house my father built die in front of me. And for the first time in my adult life, I could not make my body move. At the curb, a woman in cream linen sipped her coffee and watched it like a fireworks show. That was Bernadette Ashcombe, HOA president. 3 weeks back, she'd folded a 20 into my palm without looking at my face. "You must be the lawn crew use the service gate, and try not to track mud where the residents park." A black man in a work truck couldn't be a homeowner. Not in her Wexford Downs. So while I was gone, she took a machine to a house she was sure wasn't mine. She should have checked whose name was on the deed, and whose father laid the foundation. 22 days later, a federal judge would make her put back every single brick at her own expense. Let me tell you how. Let me back up, because the good part doesn't hit right until you know what she actually knocked down. I'm Ellison Harker, 54. 20 years in the Army as a combat engineer, which is a polite way of saying I built bridges while people shot at me and dropped the ones we didn't want anymore. When I got out, the state handed me a structural engineer's license, and I spent 15 years crawling under highway overpasses with a flashlight in my teeth, writing reports nobody reads until something falls down. I document everything. Tuck that away. You'll need it. My house sat at 4 Wexford Court. A low brick ranch the color of a graham cracker with a magnolia out front, older than the whole subdivision. That brick didn't come off a truck. My father, Amos Harker, was a master mason, and he laid every course by hand, the summer I was born, 1971. He pressed his initials into the corner of certain bricks, the way a painter signs a canvas. A.H. You could run your thumb over the letters and feel him there. On a hot day, the place smelled like warm clay and cut grass and the WD-40 I kept on the garage bench. Home has a smell. That was mine. Odessa, my wife, teaches 7th grade science, always said the house had good bones. I'd tell her bones were my department. She'd tell me to take out the trash anyway. Now here's the detail that decides this whole story, so hold it. Wexford Downs became an HOA in 1994. My father's lot existed decades before that. Keep that filed right next to the diesel. Enter Bernadette Ashcombe. Bunny, if you were foolish enough to be on her good side. 58 real estate broker, president for life of an HOA she ran like a small country she'd personally conquered. Her husband Roland sat on the County Planning and Zoning Commission, so the Ashcombes had one hand on the leash and the other on the collar. Bunny wore linen in a shade she'd probably trademarked, and carried a laminated copy of the covenants like scripture. I've been getting her love notes for 2 years. My work truck was commercial in character. My magnolia dropped unapproved organic debris. The little free pantry Odessa built by the mailbox, the one where neighborhood kids grabbed granola bars on their walk to school, was an unpermitted structure. Every letter came signed by Denton Price, compliance officer, a young man in a golf shirt with the moral spine of a pool noodle. You already met the welcome table version of her, folding a 20 into my palm without looking at my face. But the first time it turned truly ugly was at a community meeting. I stood up during public comment and asked why my $40 pantry earned 3 violations, while the Ashcombes' half-acre of imported palm trees earned a beautification award. Bunny smiled at me the way you smile at a child who used a grown-up word correctly. "Mr. Harker," she said, "some of us understand that Wexford has standards. Perhaps where you come from, community looks a little different. Where I come from is 4 houses down the same street. I'd have said so, but Denton had already cut my mic. Click. 60 seconds gone. The gravel crunched under my boots on the way out, and I remember thinking, this woman has never once been told no, and had it stick. I didn't know yet she was about to hand me the reason to make it stick forever. Takeaway. An HOA only has the authority its recorded covenants actually grant, And whether your lot was ever legally bound by them is a question with a paper answer at the courthouse. The thing about petty power is it can't sit still. A week after she cut my mic, a certified letter showed up with a fresh flavor of threat. My house was now a potential structural hazard to the community's property values, signed Denton Price. Attached, I'm not kidding, a photo of a hairline crack in my front walkway, shot at an angle that made it look like the San Andreas Fault. Here's where being a structural engineer stops being a party trick. I read the letter twice, poured a glass of sweet tea, and laughed hard enough to rattle the ice. Hazard. Friend, I inspect bridges that hold 18-wheelers. My walkway had a shrinkage crack, you fix with a caulk gun and a Saturday. But I've learned laughing at bullies just makes them louder, so I didn't call. I built a file. First, write this down. It costs nothing. I documented the actual condition of my property with dated, time-stamped photos and a 2-page condition assessment on my own letterhead. Not because Bunny deserved a report, but because the second somebody screams hazard, the person with the paper trail wins, and the person with the feelings loses. Take away date-stamped photos and a written condition record, turn he said, she said into here's the file. Second move. I drove to the Halloran County Recorder's office, a place that smells like old carpet and burnt coffee, and asked the clerk to pull 2 things: the recorded plat map for Wexford Downs and the original deed and legal description for my father's parcel. $12 in copy fees, best money I ever spent. And standing there, under those buzzing fluorescent lights running my finger down the plat, I noticed something that raised the hair on my arms. Something about where my lot line sat versus where the subdivision claimed it did. I didn't have the whole picture yet, but my gut, the same gut that's kept me alive under bad bridges, said look closer. Hold that thought, it comes back with teeth. Third move, the one that made Denton's eye twitch. I mailed the HOA a certified letter of my own. Polite, boring even. It stated I formally disputed the hazard designation, that no such condition existed, that I was a licensed professional engineer, and that any action against my property was to be directed to me in writing and to no one else. Then I posted a laminated copy, plus a big weatherproof sign right on my front door. Notice disputed. Do not enter or alt. Licensed engineer on record. Then I did the smartest cheap thing a homeowner can do. I mounted 2 trail cameras, the $30 kind deer hunters use under the eaves, aimed at the driveway and the front walk. Motion activated. And I set my doorbell camera to auto back up every clip to the cloud, so nobody could ever claim the footage got deleted. Belt and suspenders. The Army taught me redundancy isn't paranoia, it's Tuesday. Take away cheap trail cameras, plus cloud-backed doorbell footage, put your evidence somewhere the other side can't reach. Denton came by 2 days later to inspect. I met him on the porch with my sweet tea and my sign 3 inches from his nose. He stood there, sweating through his golf shirt, cicadas screaming in the magnolia like a bad soundtrack. Mrs. Ashcombe wants access to assess the... Mrs. Ashcombe can put it in writing to my attorney, I said. I didn't have an attorney. He didn't need to know that. He looked at the trail cam. He looked at the sign. He looked at a big, calm black man, standing entirely on his own property, and I watched him do the math and come up short. I'll relay that, he said, and left. Gravel crunch. Diesel from his little compliance truck idling at the curb, the smell of a man retreating. I thought I'd won the round. Technically I had. But I'd made one mistake I wouldn't understand for another week. I'd shown Bunny Ashcombe I couldn't be moved while I was standing there. So she decided to wait until I wasn't. Because that same week the phone rang at 2 in the morning. My father, Amos Harker, the man who laid the brick, had passed in his sleep up in Macon. 91 years old. A good death if there is such a thing. And I had to go bury him. I told exactly 2 people I'd be gone a week. One was Miss Ophelia Rand, 79 4 doors down, who'd known my daddy. The other was standing close enough at the mailbox to overhear. Guess which one? Picture the timing, because Bunny sure did. Tuesday, I flew to Macon in a black suit that didn't fit anymore. Wednesday, we buried my father under a Georgia sky the color of a nickel, and I stood there with a fistful of red clay, thinking about the summer he taught me a plumb line never lies. Thursday, I sorted his tools in a storage unit that smelled like motor oil and cedar, his trowels, his jointer, and a coffee can of the same stamped bricks, AH, he'd kept as keepsakes. And back in Collie Springs on that exact Thursday, Bernadette Ashcombe called an emergency special meeting of the HOA board. I've read the minutes since. 3 sentences badly typed. The board declared my house an imminent public safety hazard. They cited Denton's fault line photo. They cited my refusal to allow inspection, and they voted 3-0 to abate the hazard by removing the non-conforming structure at the owner's expense. Roland Ashcombe, Bunny's husband, the zoning man, signed an emergency administrative demolition authorization that same afternoon, skipped the 60-day notice, skipped the hearing, skipped the appeal window. Husband on zoning, wife on the HOA, one hand washing the other, and both of them washing me off my own land. Friday morning, while I watched a backhoe lower my father into the ground, a different backhoe rolled into my driveway. Miss Ophelia called me at 9:14. I still have the voicemail. Her voice shook. "Ellison, honey, there are men here. There's a machine. There..." And then just diesel, low and mean, and something cracking I knew in my gut was brick. I caught the first flight I could. And that brings us back to where this whole story started, me turning onto Wexford Court in my funeral suit and a machine sitting where my porch used to be. I want to tell you what it does to a man to pull onto his own street and find a hole where his life used to be. The magnolia was snapped off at the trunk, the little free pantry was splinters, and where my father's house had stood for 50 years, there was a pile of raw brick and busted drywall, and a bathtub sitting up on the heap like a throne, all of it under a fine red dust that hung in the July air and smelled like a wound. I didn't get out of the truck. I couldn't. I sat with both hands on the wheel and watched the last wall my daddy built come down one swing at a time. And for the first time in my adult life, my body simply would not move. A younger me would have lost his mind, asked the army about my temper. But grief does a strange thing. It slows you all the way down. At the curb, Bunny Ashcombe sipped her coffee and watched it like a fireworks show. When I finally did move, I didn't move toward her. I took out my phone, and I started documenting. Every angle. The demolition permit stapled to a stake, I photographed the number, the dumpster company's logo, the tire tracks over Odessa's flower bed, the fresh boot prints, and my laminated "Do Not Enter Disputed" sign face up in the rubble run over twice. That sign was worth more now than the homeowner's policy, and I shot it like it was the Shroud of Turin. Then I pulled up the trail cam footage in the cloud backup and sat in the heat and watched all of it. The crew arriving, Denton pointing. And this is the clip I'd play in a courtroom. Bunny herself, in that cream linen, standing at the edge of my property with her coffee, watching my father's brick fall like entertainment. At one point she said something to the foreman, and the doorbell mic caught it clean. "Finally," she said. "Some people just don't understand this isn't their kind of neighborhood." I sat with that a long time. Long enough for the diesel to fade and the crickets to start up. Here's what I did next, and it's the whole ballgame. I did not confront her. I didn't post it online. I didn't give her one single thing she could point to later and call me aggressive or unstable. I drove back to that storage unit that smells like motor oil, got my father's coffee can of stamped bricks off the shelf, set it on the passenger seat, and made 2 calls. The first was to a surveyor. The second was to an attorney named Winslow Brandt, who I'd heard once made an insurance company cry. Takeaway. When someone hands you a catastrophe, the only job in the first hour is to preserve the evidence. You can feel your feelings after the timestamps are safe. Because I still had my father's brick. I still had that itch about the plat map. And Bunny Ashcombe had just made one very expensive assumption that the man whose house she flattened didn't know exactly what he was doing. You'd think leveling a man's home might inspire a person to lie low. Not Bunny. Petty power reads silence as weakness. My quiet made her bold. 10 days after the demolition, I got, "I promise this is real," a bill. The HOA filed a lien against my now empty lot for $18,400. Demolition, hauling, and administrative processing. They bulldozed my house and then charged me for the gas. Denton's signature at the bottom like a cherry on a sundae. And the smears started the same week. Word went around Wexford Downs, the kind of word that travels through a certain type of neighbor at a certain type of book club, that Ellison Harker's house had been condemned, that it was unsafe, that there were code issues for years. Such a shame, but the man let it go. Bunny even got herself a quote in the Cauley Springs Weekly. The board had acted reluctantly to protect families and property values. Reluctantly. She had a coffee cup. Here's why I didn't go to war on Facebook. And this is the actual strategy. The person who stays calm builds the record. The person who explodes becomes the story. I was not about to let her turn HOA destroys veteran's family home into angry man harasses grandmother. So I gave her nothing. I let her talk. Every lie she told on the record was a brick I'd lay in her wall later. Takeaway. Let the other side put their story in writing and in the paper. A documented lie is worth more to you than a satisfying argument. While she ran her mouth, I ran a recovery operation. See, that demolition pile wasn't garbage to me. It was my father's life's work, and I was starting to suspect it was evidence. So before the dumpster company could haul it, I paid them in cash to leave it exactly where it sat for one more week, and I got a signed receipt saying so. Then Miss Ophelia's grandnephews and 2 guys from my old engineering crew came over on a Saturday, and we did something that must have looked insane through the neighbor's plantation shutters. We salvaged the brick. By hand. In the heat. Every brick that survived, we brushed clean-checked for my father's AH stamp and stacked on pallets. It was 101 degrees. Brick dust turned our sweat to red paste and glued itself into every crease of my hands. We drained a cooler of sweet tea to the bottom, and my lower back has never fully forgiven me. But by Sunday night, we had 11 pallets of Amos Harker's brick, thousands of them shrink-wrapped, each pallet photographed and numbered. A demolished house cataloged like an archaeological dig. Bunny cruised past twice in her Lexus, slowing down, unable to figure out what I was doing. Good. Takeaway salvage documented original materials aren't just sentimental. They're physical evidence, and a court can order a defendant to use them. Then Monday the surveyor called. "Mr. Harker," he said, "I've got 2 things for you, and you'll want to sit down for the second one." Thing 1, my property was about 6% larger than the HOA's records claimed. My father's lot had never been fully folded into the Wexford Downs plat. The subdivision was drawn around his land, and somewhere back in 1994, a lazy surveyor just assumed my daddy's parcel was in. It wasn't. The recorded covenants, the ones Bunny carried like scripture, listed the bound lots by number. My father's parcel wasn't on the list. It had never been legally annexed into the HOA at all. Read that again. For 30 years, Bernadette Ashcombe had been fining, citing, and finally demolishing a house that was never under her HOA's authority in the first place. I laughed out loud alone in my truck because Play Stupid Games was about to meet Win Stupid Prizes, and she'd rolled the dice on the one lot she had no claim to. Then I remembered he'd said 2 things. "What's the second one?" I asked. He got quiet. "That fancy new stone entrance monument the HOA's building, the big gateway with the sign and the fountain. What about it?" "It's on your lot, Mr. Harker. About 6 feet onto it. They built it on your land." I looked out my windshield at Bunny's pride and joy, going up on the corner, the grand new gateway to Wexford Downs. The whole reason I was starting to understand she'd wanted my eyesore gone. They demolished my house to build their monument. On my land. Oh, Bunny. I could have stopped right there and won. A house on land she didn't control, a monument trespassing on my dirt. That's a lawsuit that ends careers. But something didn't add up, and 15 years of inspecting things that were supposed to be fine taught me to trust that itch. Why would a woman that comfortable risk that much over one man's brick house? Follow the money. It's always the money. Winslow Brandt sent the HOA a document most homeowners don't know they're allowed to send. In Georgia, like most states, HOA members have a statutory right to inspect the association's books and records, the budget, the reserve study, the bank statements, the vendor contracts. You send a written demand, and the board has a set number of days to open the books. Refuse, and a judge makes them open the books and pay your lawyer. Takeaway. You have a legal right to inspect your HOA's financial records. A written books and records demand is the flashlight petty tyrants fear most. Bunny stalled. Winslow filed. A judge told her to hand it over. And oh, what a flashlight it was. The Wexford Downs Reserve Fund, the emergency savings every homeowner had paid into for years, supposedly $600,000, held $41,000. The rest was gone, scattered across a trail of vendor payments that all wound back to the same two names, Ashcombe and Vell Realty, and a shell development consultant called Gateway Vision LLC. Bunny's brokerage, Bunny's shell. Here's the scheme laid out plain the way Winslow finally spelled it out across a diner table, using the ketchup bottle as a prop. Bunny and her partner Sutton Vell were quietly assembling land at the front of the subdivision to build a strip of luxury live-work retail, and they were funding the land grab with the HOA's own reserves, laundered through fake consulting invoices. That grand stone monument wasn't community pride. It was the sales centerpiece for a development that needed the corner lot cleared to pencil out. My corner lot. My father's house was the last thing standing between Bunny Ashcombe and her payday. So she'd used her husband on zoning to rubber stamp an emergency demolition of a house she had no authority over, on land she didn't control, funded partly by money she'd stolen from her own neighbors, to build a monument that was trespassing for a development built on fraud. Let me be clear about the size of what she'd done, because it changes who pays. When a board acts within its authority, and in good faith the members are usually shielded, the HOA Corporation eats the loss, and their directors' and officers' insurance covers it. But when a board acts outside its authority, ultra vires the lawyers call it, in bad faith for personal enrichment, that shield shatters, insurance won't touch fraud, and the individuals become personally, financially, criminally on the hook. Take away a board's legal shield only protects members who act within their authority and in good faith step outside it for personal gain, and you're personally liable and the insurance walks away. Bunny thought the HOA was her armor. She'd just handed me the can opener. The beautiful part, she didn't know it yet. She was still over there polishing her fraudulent monument, planning a ribbon cutting. And I was sitting in a diner with 11 pallets of stamped brick, a survey, a stack of stolen financials, and a lawyer who'd stopped eating his fries because he was grinning too hard. Ellison Winslow said, "How do you want to do this?" I thought about my father's plumb line. It never lies. Publicly, I said. You don't spring a trap. You build it slow, in the quiet, while the other person is busy admiring herself. Here's how we laid ours in plain English over 5 weeks. First, I froze the land so she couldn't sell her way out of it. Winslow recorded a lis pendens on my lot and on the parcels tied to Gateway Vision. A lis pendens is a public notice filed at the courthouse that says, this property is the subject of a lawsuit. It doesn't win the case, it poisons the well. No bank will lend on it, no buyer will touch it, no title company will insure it. Bunny's whole development ran on financing, and I just wrapped her collateral in caution tape. Take away a lis pendens is a cheap public filing that freezes a property in place you can't fight over land somebody's already quietly sold. Second, we split the attack into 3 arrows because one wasn't enough for what she'd done. Arrow 1, the property case, trespass, and wrongful demolition of a structure on land never bound by the HOA. This got us an injunction and eventually the order I actually wanted. Rebuild what you destroyed with the original materials at your expense. Arrow 2, the money case. With the stolen financials, Winslow prepped a fraud and breach of fiduciary duty claim against Bunny, Roland, Sutton, Vell, and Denton personally, piercing that HOA shield because they'd acted ultra-vires for personal gain. Arrow 3, the criminal referral. We didn't file this one. We handed it a clean-tabbed binder of the embezzlement trail, delivered straight to the county DA because looting a non-profit HOA's reserves isn't an oopsie, it's a felony, and prosecutors love a case that's already built for them. Third, I rallied the people Bunny had spent years talking down to. And this part cost nothing but respect. I went door to door, the front doors of every neighbor who'd paid into that empty reserve fund. I didn't rant. I laid the bank statement on their kitchen table. $600,000 and $41,000 left, and let the number do the talking. Turns out when you show folks the HOA borrowed their kids' college money to build a fountain, the standards crowd finds their spine in a hurry. Miss Ophelia became my field general 40 years on that street, and she knew where every body was buried, figuratively, and in the case of one koi pond, nearly literally. By the end, I had 31 homeowners ready to stand up in public, and Bunny had no idea her kingdom had quietly changed sides. Fourth, and this is the one for the visual. I set the physical trap. The court had ordered the HOA to rebuild my father's house using the salvaged brick. Bunny's lawyers were still stalling on when, so I decided to hand them a deadline they didn't get to pick. Bunny had scheduled a big televised grand reveal of the new Wexford Downs gateway. Mayor invited, press invited, ribbon, giant ceremonial scissors, the whole circus, for a Saturday morning. She was going to stand at her monument on my land and cut a ribbon on a fraud on camera. So I got my old engineering crew, a licensed contractor buddy, a mobile crane, and every one of those 11 pallets of stamped brick. And in the 10 days before her reveal, working legally under the court's rebuild order, we rebuilt the front wall of my father's house, the exact facade, the magnolia side elevation, with the AH stamped corner catching the light right on my property line. 6 feet behind her monument, taller than it. We built it under a giant tarp and told anyone who asked it was utility work. Bunny drove past, slowed down, couldn't figure it out. Good. The smell of fresh mortar under that tarp on the ground, where my daddy's house once stood, just about buckled my knees. Fifth, I timed everything to go off at once. On the morning of her grand reveal with the cameras rolling and the mayor smiling, 3 things would happen in the same 5 minutes. Sheriff Ida Comstock would serve Bunny with the personal liability suit, and thanks to that binder, an arrest warrant. The crane would begin the court-ordered removal of the trespassing monument from my land, and that tarp would come down. I didn't want revenge in the dark. My father built in daylight, where anyone could check his work with a level. So would I. Trapped animals get loud right before the end, and Bunny could feel the floor tilting even if she couldn't see why. The week before her grand reveal, she threw everything she had at me. It's my favorite stretch of this whole thing, because every move she made, I'd already accounted for. Move 1, the bribe dressed up as a settlement. Suttonville showed up at my lot, not Bunny. She was too smart to come herself, with a folder and a smile like a used car ad. The HOA would generously pay me $75,000 to make this misunderstanding go away, in exchange for signing a release, a non-disclosure, and a statement that the demolition had been a mutual code resolution. 75 grand to call my father's stolen house a mutual resolution and shut my mouth forever. Here's the thing about a bribe. It's a confession with a $sign attached. A person who did nothing wrong doesn't pay you to be quiet. So I did what Winslow told me, smile, said let me think about it, and let Sutton talk. My doorbell cam caught every word, the offer, the NDA, the phrase, before this gets ugly for the board. Another brick in the wall. Takeaway. A settlement offer with a gag order attached is often an admission of guilt. Get it in writing, don't sign, and keep the recording. Move 2, the sabotage. 2 nights later, my trail cams caught a figure creeping onto my lot at 2 in the morning, with a can of spray paint and a pry bar headed for the tarp. It was Denton. Golf shirt and all, because of course it was. He tagged something ugly across the tarp and tried to lever a pallet of brick apart before a motion light I'd rigged lit him up like a stage actor. He bolted. On camera, in HD, trespassing and criminal mischief committed against evidence in an active federal case by an officer of the HOA. I didn't even report it right away. I just saved the clip and thought, thank you, Denton, for the felony. When you've got 2 trail cams and a cloud-backed doorbell, the vandals work for you. Move 3, the intimidation. When money and sabotage failed, Bunny went for fear. A code officer she was friendly with started leaving notices on a vacant lot. Mind you, nothing on it but pallets. Unpermitted material storage. Nuisance. She got a friend at the bank to hint my truck loan might get reviewed. And she had Roland float through the grapevine that my engineering license could come under scrutiny if I kept stirring things up. That last one was the mistake. Threatening a man's professional license to make him drop a fraud complaint isn't hardball. It's witness tampering and extortion, and it's exactly the thing a DA underlines twice. So every threat that came my way, I logged. Date, time, who said it, who heard it. Miss Ophelia witnessed 2 of them, and wrote her own account in cursive so neat it belonged in a museum. Takeaway log every threat with a date, a time, and a witness intimidation only works in the dark, and a paper trail turns it into the other side's confession. Here's what Bunny never understood. She thought she was pressuring me into folding. What she was actually doing was walking into every tripwire I'd laid and calling it winning. The bribe became proof of guilt. The sabotage became proof of a guilty conscience. The threats became fresh crimes. She was building my case for me one desperate swing at a time and paying for the shovel. The night before the grand reveal, she did one last thing. She called me. Herself, first time ever. Her voice was tight, sugary, dangerous. Mr. Harker, there's been some confusion. I do hope you'll be reasonable tomorrow. It's a big day for our community, and I'd hate for anyone to embarrass themselves in front of the press. I looked out at the tarp silver under the security light, at the crane parked and waiting, at my father's coffee can of brick on the passenger seat. Mrs. Ashcombe, I said, I promise you nobody's going to embarrass themselves tomorrow who doesn't deserve to. I hung up before she could hear me smile. She thought that was a threat. Threats are for people who don't have a plan. That was a weather report. I've been in real fights. The loud part is never the dangerous part. The dangerous part is the man who stopped talking and started checking his gear. That was me the morning of the grand reveal. I woke before the sun. Odessa made coffee neither of us drank. She'd been quiet for weeks, supportive but quiet. And at the door she straightened my collar, the way she does before every hard thing. Your daddy would have hated all this fuss, she said. A beat. And he'd have loved every second of it. Then she pressed a single stamped brick from the coffee can into my hand. For luck. And for him. Let me walk you through the setup, because a good trap is just good logistics in a costume. 7 a.m. My contractor buddy and 2 crane operators arrived quietly and ran final checks. The court's injunction and rebuild order were laminated and taped to the crane cab where anyone could read them. We weren't sneaking. We were the ones with the paperwork. That's the whole trick. When the law's on your side, you don't hide. You invite the audience. 7:30. Winslow parked down the block with a banker's box of exhibits, the survey showing the monument on my land, the plat and covenants proving my lot was never in the HOA, the reserve statement with 41,000 where 600 belonged, the demolition footage, the bribe recording, the Denton sabotage clip, cross-referenced, tabbed. 15 years of inspection reports had made me a man who tabs things. 7:45. Sheriff Ida Comstock texted Winslow one word. Ready. The DA had signed off. The warrant was real. She'd be there, not as a favor to me, but because a properly documented felony gives a sheriff no choice, and Ida Comstock was the rare kind of law that liked it that way. 8 o'clock. Marlo Estrada's news van rolled in. Bunny had invited the press to film her. What Bunny didn't know was that Winslow had quietly tipped Marlo that the Wexford Downs story might have a second act worth staying for. Reporters can smell a real story under a fake one the way I can smell a bad weld. Marlo brought 2 cameras. 8:15. The neighbors started gathering. Not to celebrate, to watch. 31 homeowners who now knew exactly where their reserve fund went, standing in a loose crowd behind the ribbon, holding printouts of a bank statement. Miss Ophelia in her church hat front and center, hands folded like she was waiting on a hymn. The morning smelled like fresh-cut grass and hot asphalt, and faintly the diesel of an idling crane. And Bunny arrived at 8:30 in fresh linen, glowing oblivious, giant ceremonial scissors in hand, with Roland and Sutton Vell, and poor sweaty Denton trailing behind. Denton kept looking at my tarp, then at me, then at his own shoes. Bunny didn't even clock the crane. In her mind, that crane belonged to her project. She was so certain the whole street was hers that she looked right past the machine parked there to take her monument off my land. She stepped up to a little podium beneath her fountain, the one built with stolen money on stolen ground, tapped the mic and beamed into the cameras. Good morning, Wexford Downs. Today we unveil the new face of our community, a symbol of the standards that make this the kind of neighborhood families dream of. Then she found me in the crowd, and she gave me a small, triumphant little nod. The kind you give a man you're certain you've beaten. The same nod near enough that she gave me the day she pointed me to the service entrance. I nodded back. And I raised one hand, just my hand, unhurried. The signal we'd agreed on. The crane engine turned over with a diesel cough. Sheriff Comstock stepped out of her cruiser and started toward the podium slow, a folder in her hand. Winslow lifted his banker's box. Marlowe's second camera swung off the fountain and onto the tarped wall behind it. Bunny's smile flickered. For the first time in this entire story, Bernadette Ashcombe did not know what was happening on her own street. "Excuse me," she said into the mic, laughing a little. "That machine isn't part of the Denton whose crane is." And that's the moment. Right there. The half second where the woman who's always in control feels the floor turn to water. Hold on to that feeling. Because the next thing that came down wasn't the ribbon. It was the tarp. Two of my crew pulled the release lines and the giant tarp slid off the wall and pooled on the grass in a cloud of red brick dust that caught the morning sun. And there it stood. The front wall of my father's house, rebuilt plumb and true, every course laid with the salvaged, hand-cleaned brick Amos Harker set 50 years before. The magnolia side elevation, the window he framed the summer I was born. And in the corner, at eye level so the news camera zoomed straight to it, a single stamped brick. A.H. It rose up behind Bunny's little stone monument and made the thing look like exactly what it was, something cheap built on somebody else's ground. The crowd made a sound I'll never forget, a low collective, "Oh." Miss Ophelia's hand went to her mouth. 2 streets over, a lawnmower just kept going because the world doesn't stop for justice. It only makes a little room. Then the crane arm swung. Slow, deliberate, a nylon sling settling around the neck of Bunny's precious monument. My contractor called the line every crane operator calls clear the load, and Bunny finally understood the machine was never hers. "Stop. That's you. Can't. That's HOA property, Roland. Somebody call—" "Ma'am." Sheriff Ida Comstock's voice cut through it like a level laid across a crooked wall. She stepped up beside the podium, calm as a Sunday. "That monument is sitting on Mr. Harker's land, and there's a court order to remove it. And I've got some other paper for you, so I need you to hold still." The crane took up the slack. And there in front of the mayor and Marlo Estrada's 2 cameras and 31 homeowners holding their stolen bank statement, Bernadette Ashcombe's grand stone gateway lifted 6 feet into the July air and swung gently, almost politely off my property and onto the flatbed at the curb. It looked ridiculous. A fountain dangling from a hook. Play stupid games. But we weren't done, and this next part mattered to me more than the crane. The record. Winslow had a portable screen set up on the sidewalk, the backyard movie kind. He nodded to his tech, and my trail cam footage began to play big and clear for the whole crowd and both cameras. The backhoe rolling in. My father's brick coming down. My "Do Not Enter" disputed sign getting run over. And then the doorbell audio crisp in the morning quiet. Finally, some people just don't understand this isn't their kind of neighborhood. Bunny's own voice played back to her face on camera in front of everyone she'd ever looked down on. The crowd went cold and silent. The mayor took one large step away from her, the way you step away from a downed power line. Marlowe's lens stayed locked on Bunny's face, and I almost felt something for her. Almost. Sheriff Comstock opened her folder. "Bernadette Ashcombe. I have a civil summons for you, Roland Ashcombe, and Sutton Vell. And I have a warrant for your arrest, for felony theft and misappropriation of association funds." She read the reserve numbers out loud. 600,000 paid in, 41,000 left, and 31 homeowners heard in a sheriff's flat official voice exactly where their money went. Denton, bless him, tried to slip out the back of the crowd. A deputy caught him with the sabotage clip already queued on a phone. He gave it all up in about 4 seconds. Denton was never built for the deep end. Bunny stood there in her fresh linen while the cuffs came out, and she looked at me, really looked, maybe for the first time. And her voice came out small and mean and shaking. "You think you've won? You people always... And I finally walked up to her, took my time, reached into my jacket and pulled out the single stamped brick Odessa had put in my hand that morning. Held it up so she could see the letters, so the camera could. My father laid this brick in 1971, I said. By hand, on land that was never yours, and you're going to pay to lay every single one of them back. I set the brick down gently on the podium in front of her, right next to her giant useless scissors. That's not a threat, Mrs. Ashcombe. That's a court order. Then I turned around and walked back to my father's wall, put my hand flat against the brick, warm from the sun, and I did not look at her again. Behind me, the cuffs clicked. Marlowe started her stand-up. The crane idled down, and from somewhere in that crowd of neighbors who'd finally found their spines, one pair of hands started to clap Miss Ophelia's, and then another, and then all of them. Let me clean up the wreckage because you earned the ending. The house got rebuilt. All of it, not just the wall. With my father's salvaged brick, and the HOA paid every dollar. The court ruled the emergency demolition was ultra-virus, in bad faith on a parcel never legally bound by the HOA, and it pierced clean through the corporate shield. That meant Bunny Rowland and Sutton Vell were personally on the hook, and the HOA's insurance, which doesn't cover fraud, folded its tent and went home. That $18, $400 lien they slapped on my lot, a judge voided it and made them pay my legal fees on top. Takeaway. When a board acts outside its authority in bad faith, the HOA did it stops being a shield. The people become personally liable, and the insurance disappears. Bunny took a plea on the embezzlement restitution to every homeowner she'd robbed, plus time. Rowland lost his zoning seat the same week, once the county realized he'd rubber-stamped his own wife's fraud. Sutton Vell's development died in the caution tape of that lis pendens, and never rose. Denton flipped so fast he practically apologized in cursive. Last I heard, he sells above-ground pools 2 counties over, which is the most fitting sentence I can imagine for that particular pool noodle. Ashcombe and Vell Realty doesn't exist anymore, and Bunny's broker's license is a memory. Now here's the part my father would have actually cared about. The 31 homeowners got their reserve money back in restitution, and instead of splitting it and moving on, they voted to do something with a piece of it. We rewrote the Wexford Downs covenants from the studs up. Hard spending limits, mandatory independent audits, a cap on what any board can do without an open vote, and a flat ban on emergency actions against a member's home without a real hearing. No more kings. Miss Ophelia sits on the new board now. God help anyone who tries to charge a man for his own demolition again. And with my share plus donations that poured in after Marlowe's story went statewide, we started the Amos Harker Trades Scholarship, named for the master mason who laid that brick. Every year it sends 2 local kids, the ones who work with their hands and don't always get a banner to trade school, masonry, welding, electrical, whatever calls them. The first class graduated last spring. One of them, a quiet kid who reminded me of me, is apprenticing under a mason now. He came by the rebuilt house, ran his thumb over the AH stamp in the corner, and asked me what the letters meant. I told him. And then I told him that someday, if he was any good, he'd stamp his own. We threw a block party the day the last brick went in. The whole street barbecue smoke and a bounce house and Odessa's sweet tea by the gallon, right there on the lot where a backhoe once sat like a vulture. Somebody replanted a magnolia. It's about 3 feet tall now. It'll outlive all of us. That's the point of planting them. I still catch the smell, some evenings warm clay and cut grass, and a little WD-40 drifting out of the garage. Home has a smell. I got mine back. Bunny Ashcombe was so sure a black man in a work truck couldn't possibly live up front. So sure of her standards that she never once checked her own foundation. And a plumb line, like my daddy always said, never lies. Play stupid games. Win stupid prizes. Then rebuild the man's house brick by brick. If an HOA boss or some small-time tyrant ever tried to run you over and win a stupid prize, tell me about it in the comments. Somebody scrolling down there needs to know they're not crazy and they're not alone. And if you want to watch the next petty king meet a plumb line, subscribe and stick around because we are just getting started. Keep your receipts, folks. Keep your receipts. A backhoe can erase 50 years in one afternoon. Putting it back took a survey, a lawyer, and a woman in handcuffs on live television. That was the trade Bernadette Ashcombe made, and she never once saw the bill coming. Here's the part that stays with me about Ellison. He didn't win because he got loud. He got angry, sure any man watching his father's brick come down would. But he won because he was patient enough to pull the plat map and quiet enough to let her keep talking. Remember, they mailed him an $18,400 Lena bill for the privilege of watching his own house get demolished? They'd already drained a $600,000 reserve down to $41,000. And the whole time Bunny thought that HOA was armor. It wasn't. The moment a board reaches for a house it was never given the authority to touch, that armor turns to paper. And that's the thing that ought to sit a little funny with you if you've got a board of your own. How many of us actually know where our property line ends and their authority begins? How many of us just assume they're right because the letter showed up on letterhead? If your HOA ever came after you for something you weren't sure they even controlled, tell me about it down in the comments. I read those. If this one landed, do me a favor, like it, subscribe, and send it to the one neighbor who needs to hear it. Because the smallest badge in America is a clipboard, and the folks holding it always forget that a clipboard has never once beaten a deed.